So as I mentioned in the Ash Wednesday service, through these next 5 weeks, we're going to talk about sharing our faith and doing it in such a way that won't require us to open our mouths, because that makes people nervous, and the ways around that are always nice. So the way we're going to split things up is we're going to base it on stories, because humans like stories. We like TV stories, we like book stories, we like God stories. We just like stories. And so we're going to focus on some different stories. Tonight we're going to spend some time talking about the story of me and God. Not me as in me, but me as in we. But our own stories. Then we're going to see how our story fits into God's bigger story, from humanity all the way from the beginning until the end. Then we're going to see how others start to fit into the same story. And once we've reached that point, then we'll start to see how we can start telling our neighbors about our stories with God, both by what we do and by what we say. So we're going to start out talking about our story. And this is more important than you might think it is. See, we're Lutherans. And we Lutherans, our faith is up here. We have a very thinky kind of faith, as Lutherans traditionally do. This is a side effect of us not really having a story that begins with a revival or any particular big event. It begins with a monk who was contesting intellectual ideas. We don't have a story like, say, the Pentecostal church, where they started in a really big revival with God doing powerful, obvious things for folk. We don't really have that in our Lutheran story. So a lot of times, as a side effect of this, our faith stories individually as Lutherans can be kind of brainy. And that works for some people, but it doesn't work for everyone. Take, for example, our average neighbor in Brigham City. For our average neighbor in Brigham City, their story isn't here. It's here. Their story is not in their head. It's something they feel in their hearts. Have you ever heard the expression, burning in the bosom? It's because truth is felt. Not thought about, it's felt. Do you see why this can run into problems for Lutherans? Because we tend to go about telling people about Jesus in the same way that we think about Jesus, in our heads. And it doesn't work for everyone. But everyone can relate to a story. Everyone can follow a story. So we have to be ready when the opportunity presents itself to tell our own stories. Why do we believe in this Godfellow? Not in a, well, this and this and this and this is what the reasons why no. How did you encounter God? How is it in your daily life something happened that you still come to church? What is it? This is the question that people want to hear. People don't want to hear about, there was this thing and it happened 500 years ago. And no, that's all exciting and, it's interesting, but it's not really life-changing. Because see, Martin Luther had a story with God. And his story with God influenced what he did to spark an intellectual discussion, but his story with God is where it started. You see, Luther's story with God starts with not feeling like his family would be in heaven. This is where a lot of Martin Luther's story started. He was confident that he was saved, but he wasn't sure about his family, so he did stuff. He climbed the steps of the church in Rome, because that was one of the things you did to earn points off. He did everything that he could think of to secure a place. But he came to realize that it didn't really do him any good. And so when he was reading Romans one day, or Galatians or Rome, I actually can't remember. But he was reading in the Bible one day that it's not by what you do, it's by what you believe. And then something clicked for him, and he went, oh, well, this makes a whole lot of sense. And then he went on and got hounded and pretended to be a knight for a little while and ended up having a church named after him that I'm sure he rolls over in his grave every time it actually happens. He never wanted to have a Lutheran church. Never. Poor guy. But he had a story that influenced other things that he did. And I'm sure that we all have a similar story. We can tell of times where God worked in our lives, whether it's something big and fancy or something as simple as reading in the Bible one day that we are saved by grace through faith and not by works, lest anyone should boast. Now, some people have dramatic stories. Some people have stories where they were into sin and all kinds of nonsense, and then all of a sudden, one day, God showed up and it changed their life completely. I used to be really jealous of stories like that because my story is kind of boring. I grew up in the church. I was always just kind of around God, and I thought my story was boring until I was talking to someone who had the more dramatic kind of faith story, and they told me how jealous they were of mine. And I went, what? But yours is exciting. Mine's boring. And they went, yeah, but you got to experience a lot of stuff I didn't. And I went, oh, huh. And that's when I started to realize that every story with God is important. No matter how boring we think it is or how exciting we think it is, they're all important. Because if we can't express how God worked in our lives, how would we be able to share that with someone else? If we can't express why God is so important to us, why would anyone else pay attention? I've actually had a friend tell me before that the reason they stopped going to churches was because Christians didn't act out their stories. They didn't act like God was important to them. See, this is where that word action thing will come into play, because we'll come to find out that our actions speak quite a bit louder than words. Oh, wait, someone said that once, didn't they? But the stories that we have of God are what will connect with people. The stories that where we can point to a time and say, God did this for me then. Because when people ask me why I believe in God, it's not, I don't give them some big treatise about, well, I know God is there because of this thing I saw and this thing I read here and this thing. I say, I believe in God because I think God has worked in my life in a way that only God can. I look at the coincidences in my life and I say, that can't be anything but a divine being. And I want to put my trust in that God who cares about me to manipulate events in that way. That's part of my story. And that's the short version. So the first thing that we need to do before we start to think about God in the world, before we start to think about how we interact with our neighbor, is to be secure in our own story of God. Now, I'm going to give you a little bit of homework this time, because we want to exercise these things. Sharing Jesus is something that you have to practice, just like golf, or shooting, or quilting, I mean, these are things that if you do them, you get better. If you don't do them, you don't get better. So I challenge you, this is your homework. Ready? Prepare your story. And you don't have to share it with anyone. Just, even if you just, in your head, a 1 minute, 3 minute, 5 minute, and 10-minute version of your story. So that you're ready for any situation. In 2 Peter, Peter writes to the people who are being persecuted, when you're called to account, always be ready to give account of your faith. Always be ready to say why you believe. And if you have a 1 minute, 3 minute, 5 minute, 10-minute version of your story, just kind of ready in the back of your head, you're ready. That 1 minute version, I've gotten the most use out of, by the way. Because when people ask you things, they don't want they don't want a sermon. They just want a 1 minute answer. So the next time someone, as we get to, I'm teasing a little bit down to part 2, but this is so when you get to the point of someone asking you, why are you doing this? You can say very quickly, because I believe in a God that loves you and that loves me. Instead of, oh, it's just a nice thing to do. Or just being friendly. Because those are all good and well answers, but is that really why we do it? Or do we do things because of what God has done for us? And that's why we have to start with our own stories. So that's your homework. And it's never something I'm going to check. I'm not going to grade. I'm not going to ask you to turn it in. But just have that story of you and God so that when you are called to give a reason for what you do, the answer is ready.